Have you heard about the 2018 study that showed half of prenatal vitamins tested had unacceptable levels of heavy metals? No? Well, now you have. I'm Kat, mother of 3 and founder of Ritual, the company making traceability the new standard in the supplement industry. I remember staring at my prenatal vitamins and finding all these things I was trying to avoid. High amounts of heavy metals, synthetic colorants, and unnecessary ingredients. So, at 4 months pregnant, I quit my job and started Ritual because I believe that all women deserve to know what they're putting in their bodies and why. I'm so proud of our prenatal vitamin. The ingredients are 100% traceable, it's third-party tested for microbes and heavy metals, and recently received the Purity Award from the Clean Label Project. You see, we trace like a mother because, let's be honest, no one cares quite like a mother. But don't just take my word for it. Trace for yourself with 25% off at ritual.com/podcast.
Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we have a novel episode, which we love, and we especially love it when it is a Poirot, which we have here. And on that note, Kemper, what Poirot are we covering?
We are covering Taken at the Flood, which was first published in March 1948 in the U.S. by Dodd Mead under the title There is a Tide, ... Then it was published in the U.K. by Collins Crime Club, of course, in November of the same year, 1948, as Taken at the Flood. I have one interesting factoid, actually, about the publication, which is that there was an earlier serialization, as there so often is for these novels. And per Janet Morgan, when the manuscript was submitted to American magazines, they actually objected to Poirot being in it this time. We've come across them wanting her to insert Poirot before, but they didn't like the fact that he was in it because they thought it detracted from the story's reality. They said that it was becoming difficult to sell a mystery story solved by one of the stock detectives. And they thought that it would sell well in book form, but they wanted more of a, quote, Nio Marsh type of murder mystery. I don't even know what that means.
I'm not entirely sure either, but interesting.
And that's why I just thought it was an interesting tidbit, since I know listeners would appreciate even just that phrase. My best guess is that, Nio Marsh had a stock character who was in most of her novels. That, of course, would be Inspector Allen, but he was a policeman. So maybe that was just a more grounded sort of professional detective, and the amateur sleuth was just beginning to not feel grounded enough to them. I don't know. In any case, poor Agatha went to all the trouble, apparently, of taking Poirot out of the novel, and then the magazine rejected it anyway. She had to do so much extra busy work for these magazines. I feel her pain on this. And it's just something I think we don't appreciate when we only come across these books, in their novelized form decades later, that there was all this flurry of activity going on with the serialization, which is where she made significant money. So apparently there was a Canadian magazine that did eventually take it on, the Toronto Star, with Poirot intact. So, Catherine, just a little bit more on the title, because this title, both the UK and US, come from a very specific quote. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's an epigraph at the beginning of the novel, and it is unattributed, and it reads, There is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures. I think it's slightly weird to not cite the source, but
agreed.
It's Shakespeare, and it's Shakespeare from Julius Caesar, and it's a speech delivered by Brutus to Cassius. This is after the murder of Caesar, and it's about battle strategy. Cassius wants to wait for the battle to come to them, but Brutus is suggesting that they need to act on the opportunity given, i.e. take the current when it serves, because if they stay and do nothing, they're going to lose regardless.
Yeah, it boils down to seize the opportunity, right?
Correct.
You need to seize the opportunity. I love this epigraph, and I agree that it's curious that she doesn't attribute it because the sentiment is apt. Let's just say there's someone who definitely seized the opportunity in an unexpected moment of catastrophe and made the best of things. But also, this is a Shakespeare play that is steeped in war. And this novel, it's funny because I think having read NRM not too long ago, in my mind, that is the other Christie novel that's steeped in World War II. And they, I think, function as really fascinating bookends because obviously NRM was written at the beginning of the war. And this is written right after the war and placed just as specifically in time as NRM. They are both placed down to the month and year in terms of where they are. And we'll get to that in a second. And boy, does this have a different tone from NRM. We are not in Tommy and Tuppence land here. We are in a country that has been through the ringer and people are tired and worn out and they are supposedly victorious. And,
again, I think that this is one of the rare cases where it's like important to talk about the title because sometimes we get a title, a lot of the nursery rhymes sometimes where it really is not relevant to the plot. But the quotation that she is citing here is incredibly relevant to what the plot is because Brutus and Cassius pretty much know they're going to lose. They're winning when that speech is given, but that's why the speech is given. They're trying to make one last stab at getting ahead. And also, Julius Caesar is a play about betrayal. Yeah. And about people who aren't quite what they seem to be, right?
Yeah, that's all kind of encapsulated within this epigraph already, which is fantastic. And I agree, not something that Christie usually pulls off. Well, given that, let's move right along to our victims. We could make the argument that most of the characters in the book are victims in one way or another, especially, again, given this setting. There is a lot of suffering that is going on here in different ways. But for clarity, let's focus on 3 dead people within this novel. But actually, let's focus on a 4th dead person to start, who is very much not a murder victim. He is dead before the book begins. That would be Mr. Gordon Claude, who is a very wealthy businessman and childless senior member of the Claude family. And he has served as a benefactor of sorts to all of his relatives for their entire lives. He pays everyone's bills. He's the patriarchal figure, even though he's not a father to any of them, up until he abruptly marries a much younger woman named Rosaline in New York, then returns with his bride to London, and 2 days later is killed in the Blitz. In a bomb blast that also kills 3 servants in the house, a married couple and a housemaid. Gordon's new bride, Rosaline, and her brother, a man named David Hunter, who we will get to know very well in a moment, both survive. He died intestate because upon his marriage, his original will was voided, but he never had an opportunity to make a new will. And therein lies the issue that concerns most of the characters of this book, because in the original will, Gordon Claude's money was split among his relatives, and he has many of them, and we will meet them all in a moment, but his marriage negated that. So Rosaline has all of this fortune until she dies. She is in control of all of it for the duration of her life. Okay, now on to our 3 proper murder victims. First up is
Robert Underhay / Enoch Arden, who is an enigma rolled in a cipher, rolled in a something else. Robert Underhay was Rosaline Claude's first husband, who may or may not have died from fever in Africa, but he also may be alive and killed again, going by the name Enoch Arden in the tiny village of Warmsley Vale after some, light blackmailing and getting bashed over the head.
Then we have Major Porter, who is an old war horse. We've seen this character so many times in Christie. He is the elderly colonel type, even though he is a major, not a colonel. And he inadvertently sets off most of the book. We'll see him in the prologue shortly. And he is in poor financial health and physical health generally, just not doing very well. And he appears to commit suicide via a gunshot to the head without leaving a note, which is very curious. Our third and final victim is Rosaline Claude herself, who much later in the book is found in bed having overdosed on what we subsequently learn is morphia. And by her side is a note that would seem to indicate she has committed suicide.
Right. So the suspects, it's kind of everyone. The first one is David Hunter, who's Rosaline's protective brother. He was a war hero and clearly a bit of a rogue of sorts, great in war, not trustworthy in peacetime. We've seen this character so many times at this point that it is a Christie trope. He's dark and slim and handsome and Irish, and he basically controls Rosaline and her inheritance.
Yeah, this is the Monty character, right? This is,
of course it is.
This is Christie's brother.
Philip Lombard,
et cetera, et cetera. I would argue that this is the Montiest of the Monty types that we've come across. And Laura Thompson talks a lot about this in her book as well. We should also list Rosaline Claude herself as a suspect, even though she turns up dead, since, of course, she may have killed herself. And there's also a very real possibility she may have played a role in the two earlier deaths, killing herself over remorse for playing that role. Okay, now it's time for a whole bunch more Claudes.
So we have Dr. Lionel Claude, who's Gordon's brother, and he's a respected doctor, but he's increasingly overworked and fatigued and short on funds.
Yeah, the way that he is described, I got serious John Christo vibes. A crabby doctor who has his own interests that don't make him much money, so he has to deal with patients he doesn't like, and he finds his wife really annoying. Again, John Christo. Speaking of his wife, that would be Kathy Claude, who spends a lot of time and money on clairvoyance. She definitely has a Ouija board. You know, I feel like we've seen this character in Christie before as well. She's the sort of hippy-dippy woman who believes in spirits. If you're getting the sense that a lot of these characters feel like they have appeared in other books, you would be correct in that sense.
Yes. So next we have Jeremy Claude, who's another Claude brother. This one is a well-respected solicitor, except he too is very short-handed because of the war, and he's now also under terrible financial strain.
Then we have Frances Claude, née Trenton. That is Jeremy's wife. She is the tough-as-nails daughter of a well-known Lord Trenton, who was as well-known for his racehorses as he was for being a bit of a rogue and a financial cheat himself. He wasn't necessarily the most upstanding man, although we get the sense he was a lot of fun. And I have to say, Jeremy and Frances Claude, when they were introduced, were giving me major Stephen and Alexandra Faraday vibes from
they did.
Sparkling Cyanide. To the point where if I hadn't read Sparkling Cyanide, I would have liked them a lot more, but it was so similar. And the Faradays are definitely the superior pair in terms of how they are written on the page, but there's certainly a comparison to be made there.
Yeah, and then we have Adela Marchmont, who's Gordon's sister and a widow herself. She lives in the Claude family estate. Unsurprisingly, she too is running out of money because apparently she'd never paid any of her bills. Gordon paid all of her bills.
Yeah. Then we have Lynn Marchmont, who is Adela's plucky daughter, just now home from her work in the war as part of the Wrens, which is the Women's Royal Navy Service, where she served mostly in the Mediterranean during the war. I would say that the book is told somewhat from her perspective, not solely. We certainly depart from her perspective, but she reminded me of Renesmee from Death Comes at the End, because she's been away from her family and she's returning after a long absence and realizing that everything seems to be the same, but nothing is the same. And perhaps she's not the same. And she's just trying to figure out what's going on. And she's kind of the reader's eyes and ears, at least at the beginning of the story, even though we do certainly depart from her perspective as the story
she drops
continues.
out a little bit later.
Yeah.
And then we have Roly Claude, who's Gordon's nephew. So he's Lynn's cousin. They've been engaged since before the war. And he's a farmer in Warmsley Vale, where he actually spent the duration of the war because due to a coin flip, his business partner went into service, whereas he stayed behind to run the farms for the war effort. And his business partner was killed almost immediately in the war. He's actually better off financially, it seems, than his older relatives, but basically he still really needed Gordon's money.
So we have this odd scenario in which Lynn, the woman, left for the war, and Rowley, the man, stayed at home.
Yeah, and there's clearly some issues immediately there.
Yes, that tension, too, is so specific to this post-war setting. Let's talk about the world as it appears to be, because speaking of the war, we open in a prologue in the fall of 1944. And our dear Monsieur Poirot, we see him from the get-go. Fantastic. He is sitting in the stuffy Coronation Club, waiting out yet another blitz warning. And Major Porter, late of the Royal Indian Army, he's droning on and on about the recent death in the blitz of Gordon Claude. He goes through the backstory that we just alluded to, which is that Gordon married this woman, Rosalind Claude, who had been first married to a good friend of his in Africa, Robert Underhay. And Major Porter notes that she's a pretty slip of a thing, an actress. Interesting. You better believe I underlined that in my book.
Yeah, for sure.
But she was sort of bored out of her mind in the bush, so Robert Underhay let her go back to a civilized life. But since he was Catholic, he didn't want to give her a divorce. But he really did want to let her go because he realized that the marriage was a mistake. So he was fretting to his friend Major Porter that it might just be easier for him to fake his death or some such thing, some such scheme. Right. And Porter says, I wouldn't be surprised if one day he showed up as an Enoch Arden. Here would be a good place to note that Enoch Arden, the name, is a reference to Tennyson, who we just saw referenced in The Hollow. So we know that Christie loves her Dickens and her Thackeray. Apparently she also really loves her Tennyson. This poem is about a sailor who goes missing and whose wife remarries while he's missing, so that when he comes back after this long absence, rather than upset her, he simply dies of a broken heart. And after he's done, spewing all this gossip, a face appears behind a newspaper, rather annoyed, and oopsie, that was Jeremy Claude. He was not super happy to hear all this gossip, and he storms away.
Cut to spring 1946, and Poirot is visited by Kathy Claude, who's come to him on the advice of the spirit world, because, bien sûr, she wants him to undertake a missing persons search for the aforementioned Robert Underhay, who the spirits believe is not actually dead. And Poirot turns her down for a number of reasons, such as the fact that she came to him from a Ouija board and she can't pay him. And there's something real fishy about her reasons. But some days later, Poirot's reading a newspaper and he sees a death notice for Enoch Arden in Warmsley Vale.
Dun, dun, dun.
And basically Poirot is like, what is going on in Warmsley Vale?
Cut to Warmsley Vale, where there is a whole lot of drama going on in the Claude family. So Warmsley Vale is a quaint little village hidden away from Warmsley Heath, which itself is a post-war golf development. And
of course it is.
Of course it is. And in Warmsley Vale, Kathy and Lionel Claude are hosting a soiree that partially serves as a homecoming party for their niece Lynn, who has just come home from overseas during the war. And Lynn is pretty much horrified by what's happening with her family, particularly the venom in the air that is directed at Rosalind Claude and her brother David. Rosalind, we get the sense, is sort of a pretty nitwit. She has a hard time talking to people. She seems to have this constant open-mouthed, dumb look on her face. People aren't very nice about her, but they also attribute her manner perhaps to shell shock because she is one of only two survivors of that Blitz attack that we heard Major Porter talking about. So Rosalind is ordered by the doctors to leave the city, and she and David have been living at Gordon Claude's modern country house in Warmsley Vale, Furrowbank. And they are not particularly welcome there by the Claudes. Adela Marchmont even speculates that they're not siblings, implying that David is not actually Rosalind's brother, but some gigolo side piece of hers she's keeping around. Rather catty thing for her to say, it seems.
Right.
And Lynn, of course, becomes rather taken with the rakish David, much more so than stodgy Rowley, who, let us remind ourselves, she is engaged to.
The family begins to ask Rosalind for money, since they all firmly believe they're owed it and they desperately need it. And so guilt-ridden Rosalind, weakly agrees to some of it, but when Frances is asking for a much larger sum than any of the other relatives, because, oops, guess what? Turns out her husband's embezzling. David walks in and he tells her off. And she issues a not so thinly veiled threat, basically saying, "You'll maybe regret this because I'm not going to forget how you just treated me."
So shortly thereafter, a man wanders into Warmsley Vale, checking into the Stag Inn. By the way, the only other inn that he could have gone to was, oh yes, the Bells in Motley. Wonder if Messieurs Quinn and Satterthwaite were there at the time.
Quite possibly.
In any case, he makes the bad choice of going to the Stag rather than the Bells in Motley and registers there under the name Enoch Arden. And the next morning, a letter from Mr. Arden arrives addressed to David Hunter, who reads it, and immediately he sends his sister to their flat in London. He then goes to visit Arden at the Stag Inn. At the inn, Arden tells David that Robert Underhay is his good friend, and Robert Underhay is, in fact, still alive, which would mean that Rosalind's marriage to Gordon Clode is not legal. Now, Enoch could generously keep this information to himself, provided David gives him and Underhay £10,000 by the next day. And even though it's never stated, it is heavily implied that Enoch Arden, which we know is not a real name, that this man is himself Robert Underhay. He is just coming there to blackmail on his own behalf. And conveniently, this whole conversation has been eavesdropped on by the proprietress of the Stag Inn, who immediately reports the information back to Rowley Clode. And while she's doing that, David rushes off to London, where he compels Rosalind to pawn one of her necklaces. She can't touch the principal of Gordon's fortune, of course, having only a life interest, thereby raising £5,000.
He plans to take it back that night to Warmsley Vale because, really surprisingly, he's going to allow himself and Rosalind to be blackmailed rather than risking Underhay go to the Clodes, which is what Enoch Arden had threatened.
So back in Warmsley Vale, Rowley goes to his Uncle Jeremy's house to ask advice about this whole mess. But while he is waiting for an extended period of time, he seems to get anxious about something and he just rushes out. At the same time, we get a bunch of back and forth between David Hunter and Lynn Marchmont. It gets very hot and heavy, both in person and over the phone. But we're going to gloss right on over that because, as it turns out, it's tangential to the central puzzle mystery, and we need to keep things moving right along.
So the next day, Enoch Arden is discovered murdered, face down on the rug at the Stag Inn in his room, his head bashed in with what appears to be the ball end of fire tongs. Enoch Arden has no papers of any kind on him.
So at this point, Rowley goes to London to visit Poirot, who this time is much more willing to listen to a Clode because things have gotten a lot more real than Aunt Kathy's Ouija board. And Rowley needs to know who this man is, who Enoch Arden was, and he wants Poirot to find someone who knew Robert Underhay. Poirot, of course, remembers that afternoon at the Coronation Club and arranges to meet with Major Porter. And Rowley is very impressed that Poirot is, able to just produce this person who can identify Robert Underhay. And Poirot is pleased to have impressed someone. So,
right, as he always is.
As he always is. After noting that Rowley doesn't smoke, more on that weird beat when we get to our clues, Major Porter almost immediately recognizes the dead man as Robert Underhay, and he agrees to testify to that effect at the inquest, which he does with great anxiety. And at that inquest, Rosalind vehemently insists that that is not her husband. She, too, has seen the body. The local jury at the inquest is already prejudiced against David and Rosalind. They are not very popular in Warmsley Vale, so they charge David with murder, and he is taken to jail to await trial.
At the Stag Inn, Poirot then comes across another hotel guest, Mrs. Ledbetter.
Oh boy.
Who is she's an ancient, nasty piece of work. And his conversation with her is deeply unpleasant because she spends her time berating Poirot about foreigners. She tells him to go back. Isn't the entire point of fighting the war so that people like him go back to where they came from? And then she drones on an equally pleasant tirade about how all girls nowadays are essentially prostitutes, especially the one that she saw gussied up in too much makeup and these gauche orange clothes coming out of the room where Enoch Arden was staying the other night, and she was coming out after 10 p.m.
Mrs. Ledbetter is certain that this mysterious woman was speaking with Enoch Arden at the time, which of course means that Enoch Arden couldn't have been killed till after 10, which, based on the overcomplicated whereabouts of David Hunter the night of the murder, which we are not going to get into, makes it impossible for David to have killed Arden. But
you know who one of the women who wore a lot of orange clothes around Warmsley Vale was, Kemper?
I believe that would be Rosaline Claude.
Yeah, who was supposed to be in London. But, we actually only have David's word for that. And Rosaline herself at this point has run into Poirot in the village's small Catholic church, and she seems increasingly off her rocker. She's racked with guilt by something and paranoid, and seems to think that she has done something completely evil.
Back in London, Poirot pays a visit to Major Porter, only to find that, oops, Porter has shot himself at his desk, although Porter didn't leave a suicide note, and Poirot feels that that is rather unlikely for an orderly man such as Major Porter. So we're sort of presented with that suicide, but with a whole lot of misgivings. There must be something more that's going on there. Then we go back to Warmsley Vale. Poirot, he and Frances Claude have a real talk. Frances admits that this Enoch Arden character was not, in fact, Robert Underhay, but Charles Trenton, her criminal cousin. And remember, Frances's family they're all rogues and not the most upstanding of people.
The reason Frances confides in Poirot is because Poirot already knows. He knew when he had visited them earlier because he had seen the pictures on their shelves of the Trenton family. And Frances and her father and Charles Trenton all look exactly the same. Poirot guessed, and Frances understood that he guessed. And this is going to come up again because somebody else in this story also guesses.
She put up her cousin to this job of blackmailing David Hunter and essentially pretending to be Robert Underhay, or at least intimating that he was, or that he was good friends with Underhay, who was alive. And Frances, of course, did that because David Hunter was so dismissive of the Claude's financial claims. The only thing Frances doesn't understand, and neither do we at this point, is why on earth Major Porter then would have identified Charles Trenton as Robert Underhay, because that dead body was definitely not Robert Underhay. So the Major Porter suicide has just gotten that much more mysterious. Later on, Poirot and Lynn decide to mosey on over to Furrowbank to have a little chat with Rosaline, but you know what? She dead. She apparently committed suicide because, unlike Major Porter, she has the start of what appears to be a suicide note. It's a sort of confession which is talking about her horrific guilt.
After this, it looks like the woman seen in the Stag Inn and Enoch Arden's rooms must have been Rosaline herself, and that she must have just clubbed him over the head. David, if he wasn't already cleared, is now cleared. That means Lynn, in the meanwhile, goes to tell Rowley that the wedding is off, and she's going to go run off immediately with David. Rowley, at that moment, goes on to a rant about how he feels emasculated by his role in the war, and that if he can't have Lynn, no one can, and then he proceeds to strangle her to death. Almost strangle her to death, because Poirot politely coughs in the doorway. He interrupts the murder, then, calmly wraps a cold, damp cloth around Lynn's neck, makes Rowley give them coffee, and then David rushes in and is basically like, what happened to your neck? And Poirot makes him sit down, too. And, I think we can get into some clues.
Clue number 1. We would do well to keep in mind that the Claudes don't really know Rosaline and David, never having met them while Gordon was alive. It was only after the bomb blast that they first saw the brother-sister pair. This is why Adela Marchmont hypothesizes, cattily, that David Hunter isn't actually Rosaline's brother. But the deduction here for an extremely astute reader is to wonder, what if Christie flipped this assumption on its head, as she so often does? What if instead of David not being who he says he is, it's Rosaline who isn't who she says she is? Let's just keep that possibility in mind for a moment.
Clue number 2. Poirot gets Dr. Lionel Claude to admit that he's been suspicious of the manner of death of Enoch Arden. Had it not been for the fire tongs that were by the body, he would have sworn that Charles Trenton had been bashed in by a brick. Poirot already knows this because we have already seen Poirot earlier tracing a finger along one edge of the fireplace and noting that while one side is sooty, the other side is clean. And so the deduction here is that Charles Trenton was killed by the fireplace and not the tongs.
And it's the fireplace curb, which I wasn't completely even sure what that was, but it's the sharp rectangular protrusion on the floor that comes out from a fireplace, not the mantle on the floor. You know, the kind of thing one could perhaps fall onto. All right, clue number 3. This clue builds on our first clue about Rosalind perhaps not being who she says she is. We know that Rosalind can't be Catholic since we learned in the prologue from Major Porter that she was okay with getting a divorce from Underhay. It was Underhay, the Roman Catholic, who was not willing to grant that divorce. Sure, Rosalind is Irish, but of course many Irish people are Protestants. And yet, she shows up in Warmsley Vale's Roman Catholic Church later on in the novel. So what gives? Well, the deduction here is that the Rosalind in Warmsley Vale does not match up with the Rosalind of Major Porter's backstory, i.e. Rosalind cannot be who she says she is. And it's worth noting for us Christie fans that Christie used this very same Catholics don't grant divorces clue way back in the day in podcast favorite, or at least Kemper favorite, Lord Edgeworth Dies.
Clue number 4, Major Porter's gaffe when he meets Poirot and Rowley. He offers Poirot a cigarette, but he doesn't to Rowley, saying, "Oh, but you don't, do you? Smoke." That is, right? I don't want to pretend like I'm always a master of observation, but I 100% noted that line immediately because there's something immediately wrong there. He's just met Rowley. How would he know that he wasn't a smoker? Unless, and our deduction is that Major Porter had met him before.
Clue number 5. We understand why Charles Trenton, posing as Enid Garden / Robert Underhay, doesn't want to see Rosalind, because Rosalind would immediately say, "That isn't my first husband / one of my first husband's friends." But why is it that David Hunter doesn't want Rosalind to see the blackmailer so that she could at least confirm whether he's Underhay or a friend of Underhay's? Why does David instead whisk Rosalind off to London? I think this is the best clue in the book.
Yeah, it kind of is.
Because it has such a convincing cover. Rosalind is emotionally frail, and David wants to remove her from the center of any potential conflict with Arden / Underhay. But it just doesn't make sense that he wouldn't take this opportunity to verify the man's identity before submitting to the man's blackmail scheme, which leads us to...
Clue number 6. David immediately acquiesces to the blackmail, even though people do not change, and David is not the kind of person to be blackmailed. Why would that person so easily go along with blackmail? And it's because he can't risk Robert Underhay being Robert Underhay. He can't risk that this is actually Rosalind's first husband.
Yeah, there's some reason why Robert Underhay seeing Rosalind would just be an absolute catastrophe. Okay, it's time to resolve this thing, but it's worth noting how confusing motive is in this novel, because David and Rosalind are the only characters who had a motive to kill Arden / Underhay, who, if he was who he said / implied he was, would have effectively cut them off from Gordon Clode's fortune, whereas the Clodes all had a motive to keep Arden / Underhay very much alive. And then it's reversed when it comes to Rosalind. The Clodes all had a motive to kill her, since her death means they're all in the money again, whereas David has a motive to keep her very much alive. So what is going on?
Here's a funny fact. We have 8 deaths in this novel and only 1 murder. Here's what happened. Robert Underhay died of a fever in Africa, natural death. Gordon Clode, along with 3 other people, died as a result of a German bomb during the war. Charles Trenton was, an accident. Major Porter was a suicide, exactly what it looked like. And Rosalind Clode was, in fact, not a suicide, but was murdered.
What? Let's figure out exactly what's going on here. Rowley Clode did exactly what Poirot did when he went to his Uncle Jeremy and Aunt Frances's house, and he saw a photograph of Charles Trenton, and he realized that this Enid Garden character was, in fact, Frances's cousin. And he went to the hotel to confront Charles Trenton, where, as he puts it, "I just saw red when I realized that my own family was, as I saw it, double-crossing me. I called him a swine and hit him, at which point Trenton fell backwards, hit that fireplace curb, and died on impact." Rowley freaks out. He soaks the tongs in blood. He wipes down the fireplace curb, and he makes this accident look like a murder.
Then, remembering Uncle Jeremy's club story, Rowley books himself an appointment with Poirot while also paying a visit to Major Porter, where he presumably offers him money to identify Charles Trenton as Robert Underhay. And then he essentially sets up Poirot, which, we've seen people try before, but he does a surprisingly good job at it here.
Well, and he does it by playing on his vanity.
Yes, he does. Major Porter, unfortunately, is racked with guilt because he's now perjured himself during the inquiry and he can't go through with the trial. And so Rowley tries to convince convince him not to do anything too hasty, but by the time he gets to London, Major Porter has written a suicide note / confession and killed himself. So Rowley pockets a suicide note because it's a confession and dashes out of London.
Right, so that is the suicide that almost seems like a murder because there's something fishy going on with that absence of a note, but it is in fact a suicide. Then meanwhile, David Hunter has gone to the Stag Inn to pay off Enoch Arden, but of course Arden / Trent is already dead. Now it's David's turn to freak out, which is when he goes through a labyrinthine series of maneuvers that take up quite a bit of space in the book. And while it pains me to gloss over them because they involve both a tangential clue we first saw in the mysterious Mr. Quinn story, The Sign in the Sky, as well as costuming, it was David dressed up as that lady, the foul Mrs. Ledbetter saw in the hotel. The purpose of all this is for David to establish an alibi that clears him of the murder of Enoch Arden, i.e. a murder he did not commit, as he was instead allowing himself to be blackmailed by this man. And why was that, Catherine?
Because Rosaline died with Gordon in the Blitz. The Rosaline the family knows as Rosaline is in fact the Irish housemaid Eileen Corrigan, who was the same age as Rosaline and also Irish.
Though unlike Rosaline, a devout Roman Catholic.
Who David had convinced to play the part of his sister so that they'd keep his sister's money. Essentially, they're the two survivors of the bomb. And David sees an opportunity. It's David who puts a tablet of high-dose morphia into her container of sleeping bromides so that eventually she's going to die because she's going to eventually take that one. And it will look like she kills herself because increasingly Eileen is becoming more and more unhinged and more likely to blow the entire thing. And also, at this point, David has legitimately fallen in love with Lynn. After all this is pointed out by Poirot, he does a runner. You know, he's swiftly caught. And instead of even fighting it off, he just gives up because he knows the game is up. He is a gambler, and he knows when to fold them, and now he's folding them.
Yeah, very in keeping with his character, and in keeping with his character that he sees the opportunity, right, in the moment of that bomb blast, and it only kind of sort of worked because she just didn't have the wherewithal to pull it off. This is almost the end of the story, but we're not quite done yet, are we, Catherine?
Oh, you know what, Kemper? I wish we were.
Well, let us remind listeners that Lynn Marchmont was about to be strangled to death by Rowley, who isn't technically a murderer. The death of Charles Trenchard was manslaughter, and while he suborned perjury and tampered with evidence at a crime scene when it came to Major Porter, not to mention his duping of Poirot, all this falls far short of murder. But Rowley at this point is beside himself and essentially tells Lynn he's not good enough for her. Lynn thinks otherwise.
Oh, boy.
So, Lynn has this taste for adventure and excitement, and Rowley just wasn't cutting it, especially after all of her experiences in the Wrens. But now that he almost murdered her, she realizes that a life at Rowley's side in Warmsley Vale wouldn't be so safe after all. So she is going to live happily ever after with him. The end.
Interesting choice.
Indeed. More on that later when we get to our Stuck in Its Time category in the rankings. So we have one English language adaptation for this novel. It is, of course, the David Suchet adaptation. This one dates from 2006, and it's actually season 10 of the series. And this is later on in the series when they were doing the novels. They're kind of ticking them off for completion. Right. And this is not one of my favorite of the Suchet adaptations. For starters, this is a rare instance where the Suchet series decision to set everything in and around 1936 is actually problematic. It's almost never problematic, but it is here because, of course, this story is so anchored to the post-war setting. So the relationship between Rowley and Lynn is not anchored in the idea that he didn't go off for the war and she did. She was abroad and she sort of had her own adventures, but that's immediately just different from how heightened those tensions would be in and around World War II and service to one's country. And then, of course, the bomb blast is not a bomb blast. It's this explosion that we find out that David Hunter actually rigged himself, which completely then belies the starting off point of the book, right? Which is, again, taken at the flood, seize the opportunity as it comes. Yeah. It makes him much less of a villain because if he planned this from the beginning, then he really didn't do a good job. I mean, this was just something something that fell into his lap, so to speak, and he did the best with the opportunity he was given in the novel. And that makes so much sense for him as a character. And then the flaws in his plan. I mean, I think it's a huge reason why the puzzle mystery works, even though it's outlandish. But if he was planning this whole thing, that's a problem.
He's mercenary.
And impulsive, yeah. And I mean, only a extremely mercenary and extremely impulsive person would have done this. But I 100% believe that David Hunter would have. If this is something that he planned, then I have all sorts of problems with it that I don't have in the novel. So there's that. But there are other reasons, I think, why this adaptation doesn't work.
I mean, the threatening phone calls did not work great for me.
Rosalind Claude.
You're not a Claude. You're a slut. A filthy, stinking, Irish slut.
Per our good friend Mark Aldrich, who often has such helpful, pithy comments on adaptations, this is what he said, and I wholeheartedly agree. Perhaps in an attempt to shore up interest, the cast almost uniformly give arch and ostentatious performances more at home in Marple than Poirot.
Can I also, this is going to sound very petty, David wasn't attractive enough.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I know that sounds petty, but the thing is that's really important. I think he has to be really attractive.
And to make your comment a little less petty, charisma is part of attractiveness. So it's not just his physical appearance.
No, right.
Right? Like he didn't,
though, too. Yeah.
He didn't pull off the whole David Hunter kind of thing, which as a reader, I was imagining every time David Hunter was on the page.
His bluntness is really appealing in the book, right?
Yeah.
Whereas he's just like kind of like has like a cartoonish sneer from the get-go in the adaptation. And you're like, well, you would never be charmed by this person.
No, he's just
or find him attractive or think that there was not something real off with him.
That was a big problem. I mean, a couple of other things, too, I just found curious because this really was unusually, I think, for us, certainly for me, a Suchet adaptation that I think fell far from hitting the mark. Major Porter's suicide is unquestionably a suicide from the get-go. So we get none of, and I love that intrigue in the novel. I think it's so clever to have a suicide that seems like it might not be a suicide that is in fact a suicide. And then the clue that you appreciated so much as a reader and even got as a reader, Catherine, the "you don't smoke, do you" clue, gets watered down to Porter merely not asking Roly Claude for a cigarette. We're supposed to glean from the absence of a question about smoking that Porter would have known Roly, which is just not as strong of a clue. It's not as fair. Then Rosaline doesn't get killed off. I wouldn't even have that much of a problem with that. But by far the worst change here is that David has forcibly impregnated Eileen as part of the backstory, Eileen the maid, and then forced her to have an abortion.
Even though she's a very religious Catholic.
Because she's a religious Catholic. So what he wanted to do was break her spirit in preparation for the explosion that he planned so that she would just go ahead and do whatever he said. Again, this is a different character.
So far away from what's going on in the book. I mean, it's the most interesting part about him. Up until Rosaline's overdose, he's an amoral opportunist. He doesn't actually do anything that is,
evil. He's not evil. He's amoral. He's out for himself, whatever that means, be it I want money or I want Lynn because I'm in love with her. And he will do whatever he needs to get what he needs. But he's not evil. In the adaptation, he's beyond evil. I mean, so evil that it's unpleasant to watch. So there's that unpleasantness. And from what I can gather, because David Suchet talks about this in his book, Poirot and Me, he says that this was an opportunity to showcase Poirot's Catholic nature because he's so horrified by this whole forced abortion thing. But as a character trait, we get that other places. I didn't need them to alter the story this way just for that. I will say this, we saw Sarah Phelps do an adaptation of the ABC Murders, which is also one of Christie's darker Poirot novels. I feel like Sarah Phelps would have a field day with this book because it is so dark. You could go dark, but stay true to the source material. If I were recommending another Poirot book for her to adapt, not that I am, and not that she seems to have any desire to do that, this would be certainly one that I would put at the top of the list.
Because, I mean, if you look at it, the Claudes are not good people.
Oh, no. Yeah. I mean, honestly, they're just as mercenary as David Hunter is, just that they don't have the power. I could just see Sarah Phelps doing one of her sort of gonzo, everyone is horrible, the world is just a terrible, terrible place. But again, staying true to the source material. And then we should just note there is also a 2011 French language adaptation of this within the Little Murders series, which is actually a series that we will be exploring soon via our Patreon site. Yes. So stay tuned for that. Let's segue into our rankings for this novel. I think that plot-wise, this novel does quite well. I would actually argue that we get echoes of 1-2 Buckle My Shoe here, but only in the best of ways. Like the best element of that novel was all of that business with the corpse that was presumed to be Mabel Sainsbury Sealed, and then it was disfigured to conceal the fact that it actually was Mabel Sainsbury Sealed. Right. We kind of have that same bewildering but ultimately satisfying pattern with Major Porter's death, and even with the Enoch Arden stuff, because, you know, from the moment that he turns up, we're thinking, okay, this is Robert Underhay, but then the fact that he isn't is also quite satisfying. So I feel like she's spinning a lot of plates here, plot mechanics.
Yeah, and also, I mean, you have the notion that from the very get-go, you think that the bad guy is David Hunter, and then David Hunter isn't the bad guy, but then David Hunter is the bad guy. It's not even quite the double bluff.
No, it's not a double bluff. She's presenting us with two men who are on opposite ends of the spectrum.
Right.
And then they just get flipped at the end of the story. But then they get flipped again because the one who actually was responsible for 2 out of 3 deaths gets the girl and has the happy ending. As I said, I think she's spinning a lot of plates here and she's pulling it off in terms of plot mechanics, which is saying a lot for Christie because she's a master plotter. But I think this is one where she's doing it quite well. In terms of plot credibility, I believe it 100%. I believe that David Hunter acted as he did, even though some of the things he did were outrageous, and he made those snap judgments both before the book began and then at the very end of the book when he kills Rosaline. And I also believe Rowley. Like I think she sells who he is. I was talking in the beginning about how so many of these characters remind me of other characters. One of the earliest descriptions of Rowley is that he seemed slow, but he was perhaps not quite as slow as he seemed. That maybe there was a little bit more to him than meets the eye. And that immediately, I wrote this in the margin at the time, and I did not remember what happens at the end of this book. I wrote Gerda Christo.
Yeah.
It's a similar thing, right? When backed into a corner, he did what he had to do and he committed many immoral acts. The fact that Poirot does not turn Rowley Claude into the authorities is outrageous, but in keeping with Poirot's extrajudicial reckonings of so many of these cases. And it is actually perhaps one of the few weak points of the plotting here. It's on the very last page too. You can feel Christie trying to tie up all of those loose ends as quickly as possible. They think that David Hunter killed Enoch Arden as well as Rosaline. Here's what Christie writes. They won't charge him with it because it isn't necessary. Meaning, because they're charging him with the murder of Rosaline, they're not going to charge him with the murder of this other man because, he's already been charged with one murder. That is not how the criminal justice system works. And then even worse, Lynn says, besides, I believe you can't be arrested twice on the same charge. Double jeopardy is as to being tried twice on the same charge, not arrested. And that to me feels, again, like a slight weak point, because in reality, Rowley would have to be brought in and he would probably have to serve a little bit of time at the very least. But she wanted to have her super happy ending of the murderer getting his girl. So,
oh gosh.
Even so, I would argue for plot mechanics that we give it at least a 7.
I think that's fine.
So 7 for plot mechanics. And then for plot credibility, I don't think that credibility is through the roof here. I don't think that there are major holes in it either. So I would come out at either a 6 or perhaps a 7.
David Hunter, his motivations make complete sense.
Mm-hmm.
As do the Claude's motivations. There is a little bit too much of, well, isn't this convenient in a lot of it?
Yes.
And that is distracting to me, which would prevent me from ranking it particularly high.
Yeah, for some reason I think a 6, which is still high.
Yeah, that seems right.
Okay, so a 6 for plot credibility. Then we get to series-long characters. Of course, this is our beloved Monsieur Poirot. I suspect that you are higher on this category than I am, Catherine. I mean, I don't think this is one where Poirot feels as much like Poirot.
No, although he's necessary to the plot. You know, sometimes where it's like, oh, he could be like a little superfluous. Like she shoehorned him in. He's necessary to the plot of this one.
No, he is. And he's there from page 1, right? Which I appreciate.
Yeah. But I mean, as far as Poirot's personality, we don't get that much of it here.
I agree. And, we didn't even mention the principal police investigator on the case, whose name is Superintendent Spence, and who will go on to appear in 3 more Poirot novels, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, Halloween Party, and Elephants Can Remember. So technically, he's a series-long character too, but we don't get too much to distinguish him at this point. And as we already said, unfortunately, we can pretty much say the same thing about Poirot here. I mean, it really felt like he was Superintendent Spence's much more distinguished and clever superior in this.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to do a 4. I suppose I could be convinced to do a 5.
Yeah, a 4 or 5. I mean, I would be inclined to a 5 just because of his plot function.
I think that's fair too. And I actually, after this conversation, a 4 feels low. I agree with that. He is so integral to the plot in a way that he isn't always. And I do appreciate that. So then we come to book-specific characters. I mean, this is where Christie sometimes suffers from the fact that she wrote so many books. Right? We've seen so many of these characters before that it was hard to feel as though many of these characters had the freshness that they would require to pop off the page. And I realize that's a critique people often level against Christie, that she reuses the same characters over and over again. And while that's true to an extent with certain characters, looking at you, Anglo-Indian colonels and angry young socialists, I think for the most part, Christie actually manages to populate each book with an array of fresh-seeming characters, but not so much in this book, To be completely honest, I did not find any of them compelling.
I mean, Mrs. Ledbetter is an interesting piece of work.
She certainly is.
You already pointed to it. It's not that the characters are bad. It's that every single one of them we've seen multiple times before, and there's nothing differentiating any of them. The one that is the most interesting probably is Frances.
Frances, yeah, I think because of her rakish family, she's a little bit like a female David Hunter, right? Even though she's older and settled.
There is a nice scene, I do think. It's actually the nicest moment in the book. He keeps telling her that she chose poorly or whatever, as though she picked him for his money. And she says, no, I picked you because I was in love with you.
No, it's incredibly sweet. And it would be powerful if it didn't make me think of Stephen and Alexandra Faraday.
Yeah, sure.
In Sparkling Cyanide. And I agree that I think the addition of their shared grief over losing a son in the war, I found to be a really affecting scene when she's thinking back on that. And let's not forget, at this point, Agatha Christie's son-in-law, her daughter Rosalind's first husband, had been killed in the war. And actually, it's one of my favorite references in the book, because in the course of that scene, she makes this throwaway reference saying, well, I guess I should have known what a silly romantic he is because he has so many Stanley Wymans in his bookshelf. And I had no idea who Stanley Wyman is. And he is this now forgotten author of romantic historical novels, who was really popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Oscar Wilde, Graham Greene, and Robert Louis Stevenson were all admirers of him. And he was immensely popular. Like, Christie definitely read a lot of his books, and it's one of those references that's just lost to the sands of time. But in 1948, even, still, people would have known who Stanley Wyman is.
Everything about that sequence is the nicest part of the book.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm coming out on a 6.
It's almost generous, but I think that that's right.
I think that it is generous, but I think the book deserves a little bit of generosity. Okay, then setting and tone, this is a book that is set in post-war England. People are constantly railing about the state of the economy. The sort of societal ills are on display here time and again.
We also didn't bring it up. It hasn't come up in a while, but we have some classic Christie ranting about taxation.
Oh, I started keeping a running count of how many times she mentioned taxes. I only got to 5, which doesn't sound like a lot. And I think there are at least a couple more than that. But it actually is a lot, because she usually has it once or twice in most books, because it was such an overriding concern of hers, especially at this point in her career when she was established and just, with all of the overseas revenue she was generating, she was just getting hammered with taxes. Yeah. But in here, just time and time again, people talk about how taxes are impoverishing them and they don't know how they're going to make ends meet. There's throwaway references at one point to one of the Clodes, I think it's Kathy Clode, queuing up with other grim-faced housewives. We'll see this, I think, again in Murder is Announced, too. The meager way.
Austerity.
The austerity, exactly, that people were put under. It gives you this sense of what it was like right after World War II to be living in England in a way that I think you couldn't get from a non-fictional account. Like, this is one of the ways in which novels are so helpful. I don't think that we can often say that about a Christie novel, but I truly feel that way about this novel.
I know. Well, the intense bitterness is really interesting. And I mean, not to go back to Mrs. Ledbetter again, but that scene where she's ranting at Poirot, what did we fight this war for if not X? And Poirot thinks to himself, well, I'm not going to engage because everybody has a different reason.
Nonsense, said the old lady. That's what we fought the war for, isn't it? So that people could go back to their proper places and stay there. Poirot did not enter into a controversy. He had already learned that every single individual had a different version of the theme, what did we fight the war for? Everyone's expectation coming out of it was that problems would be solved, and that couldn't be further from the truth. It's that letdown, right, of we're all in this together and we're going to see it through. And now they have, and no one is on the same page. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to read. I mean, I don't know if you feel this way, but it's interesting to read as Americans because obviously we have a slightly different take of post-World War II as Americans.
As in, yippee!
Yeah, kissing in the streets, boom period. Let's build a bunch of like little starter homes and a bunch of communities. And, you know, this is a very different thing that we're talking about here.
This is very different. Yeah, contrast that with this is Lynn thinking to herself at the beginning of the novel. But that's what's the matter everywhere. I've noticed it ever since I got home. It's the aftermath war has left. Ill will, ill feeling. It's everywhere. On railways and buses and in shops and amongst workers and clerks and even agricultural laborers. And I suppose worse in mines and factories. Ill will. And nowhere more so given this specific situation than in Warmsley Vale with the Clode family, but it feels like a specific crucible that is representative of what is happening in the country at large.
I really appreciate how specific it is to when it is set and the insights that it's giving.
And then the tone, this is, as always, a very readable Christie novel. And it's complicated, as you can tell from how long it took us to summarize what is happening here.
There's a lot of plot going on here.
She's up to her usual snuff in terms of writing style. I do think it's interesting that the Mary Westmacott book that she wrote around the same time as this, which is The Rose and the Yew Tree, is also very much preoccupied with these post-war sorts of themes. And we actually just posted a Patreon episode about another Mary Westmacott novel, Unfinished Portrait. So we haven't quite gotten to The Rose and the Yew Tree yet, but you know, it's interesting to, I think, compare and contrast what she's exploring in those novels and how she's exploring it as a non-mystery writer. In any case, setting and tone, I was coming out on an 8.
8, I think, is good.
Okay, so we just have Stuck in Its Time left, and right up until that last scene, the only thing I could point to is that Mrs. Ledbetter uses the N-word once, which, you know...
Well, except Mrs. Ledbetter is supposed to be a horrible person. So.
That was going to be still 0 deductions, because within the mouth of Mrs. Ledbetter, that is part of her character. I get it.
I will also note at one point Lynn suggests that some of the girls are asking for it, quote unquote. Yes. And that comes out of Lynn's mouth, and we're supposed to be sympathetic towards Lynn.
That's not great, although it's funny, Laura Thompson quotes that line as evidence of Christie's evocation of a world gone mad and a sort of topsy-turvy world of just another sort of unpleasant element to everything. It's surprising that Lynn is the one saying that. Soldiers attacking girls, and maybe the girls were asking for it because we expect her to be younger and savvier, I suppose, about gender relations. But I think you could make the argument that that's in keeping with the world that she's evoking. But agreed. I think that adds to this element here that we see in the final pages. I mean, what I found so especially distasteful is the fact that Rowley is almost trying to dissuade her from being with him because he doesn't trust himself.
He's fully dissuading her.
This is what he says. No, Lynn, I can't let you risk it. Apart from anything else, can I trust myself? What I mean is it wouldn't be safe for you. I knew once the word safe was used because we know that Christie does not like when people choose safety over audacity and courage.
So that's why you go back to a domestic violence situation. Unsettling to the extreme.
It's a misfire. I think it deserves 2.
I think so too.
There are many, I think, who would argue, and we should at least put up this argument, even though I don't think either of us particularly subscribes to it, that Christie knows exactly what she's doing here, and she's giving us a false happy ending because, again, this is a world in which happy endings aren't really possible, and maybe the world will get better, maybe it won't. But right now, in this moment, in 1946, a year out after VE Day, it's just not possible because the world is a crazy, crazy place.
I mean, that's certainly not how it reads.
Yeah,
so
I agree. There are some that would probably say we're not giving her enough credit. But I think that also actually is why I would only give it 2 and not like 4 as we gave Peril at End House. Because I think that argument of like, oh, the anti-Semitism is knowing and wink, wink, no. Like, I don't think anyone can legitimately make that argument. But you could at least make the argument that she does know what she's doing here.
This is a little bit of benefit of the doubt scenario, but sure.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the 2 deductions are giving her a little bit the benefit of the doubt.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So that brings us to a grand total of 7 plus 6 plus 5 plus 6 plus 8 minus 2 for 30 points, putting Taken at the Flood in 20th place. It is currently sitting between the Sittaford Mystery, which is in 19th place, and 1-2 Buckle My Shoe at 21st place. And at this point, we have now covered 38 novels. So it's midway, which generally feels right to me. Fortunately, Catherine and I will be doing a State of the Rankings episode very shortly, since we are coming upon our anniversary, Agatha Christie's birthday, September 15th. So if we feel the need to adjust that in either direction, I think we can. Would you agree, Catherine? Perhaps we need to adjust that a little upward?
I would say that it feels a little bit low, but we can revisit that as we clink our glasses of champagne together and celebrate this anniversary and Dame Agatha's birth.
That is Taken at the Flood. Join us next week for our anniversary episode. As we just alluded to, we will be doing a State of the Rankings and making sure that the order for our 38 novels at this point out of 66 all make sense and that all is in order there. We love being able to geek out about the novels that we've covered en masse. So really looking forward to that. And the next story we'll be covering after that, just to give you a heads up in case you're reading along, is Parker Pyne's Oracle at Delphi. And in the meantime, we would love to hear from you. We mentioned we have a Patreon website on which we cover all sorts of extra goodies and bonus content and whatnot. Latest being that Mary Westmacott title, Unfinished Portrait. So visit us there at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. You can find us on Facebook. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha. Our Twitter handle is All About the Dame. Catherine's is at Brobcat. We are also on email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, and we are on Instagram at allaboutagatha, and we would very much appreciate it if you would take a moment to rate and review us if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.